think our interview with Dar went really well. I'm really happy with that. But it's again, it was like I fucked up interviews, not on purpose. What I mean is I've had such bad technical glitches before where I've lost, someone's audio completely.
I was doing this documentary and it was a bunch of interviews. Noam Chomsky, Elizabeth Warren, and I knocked the hard drive off the desk and I lost them.
Oh, wow.
Luckily, Noam Chomsky let me just come back.
You talked to Noam Chomsky, though?
Oh, yeah.
That's crazy.
But
awesome.
I had Elizabeth Warren on there, and that was before she ran for governor or whatever. It was about the financial crisis.
Okay.
So I was like, she had done a lot about housing stuff, so I was...
Sure. Well, that's cool.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to talk with Noam. He was like the guy that got me, like when I was a teenager, and I think it was like I was like 15, 14, and I was starting to kind of get a little bit of an understanding of the first thing that got me actually was libertarianism, because I was in Idaho and Ron Paul was running.
Right,
Remember the Ron Paul revolution?
Right,
yeah.
right.
Oh,
Yeah, that was a big deal,
It totally was.
And he was saying shit, in these national debates with Republicans, like we need to get out of Iraq, we need to stop having all these military bases around the world, these interventionists.
Audit the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, and I didn't have any like substantial critiques of capitalism. I didn't understand that at the time, so I remember just being kind of interested in that. And I even saw him, he came to the town I live in, Twin Falls. He came to Twin Falls and spoke at the local auditorium, the high school auditorium there.
With a packed crowd?
Yeah.
I bet.
There were a lot of teenagers there with his books, like they love him, And then around 16-ish, I don't know when, I just started getting into, like, I found about Noam Chomsky. And I read Hegemony or Survival, and then I read Failed States. Actually, I'm going to plug that phone in real quick before I forget. But, it was, like, kind of crazy. Like, I started to really get a grasp of American foreign policy at that point, and that was, like, my entry into radical politics.
Yeah, you could probably have him on the show. Like,
I mean, I've tried. The difficulty is always trying to get contact information. Like
I'll send you over the I mean, like I think it's still just the public MIT one that he was using.
Yeah.
He like when I was there, it was like it's like every time I've been there, it's like I sit down in a room and there's like people, and then they're like next person, next person.
That's crazy.
It was like someone doing a documentary on Sheriff Arpaio, and then like right afterwards, like his assistant, because that was the deal. Like the assistant's like, I'm going to tell you you're done. When I say you're done, you're fucking done. Don't try to get another question in. You're done. So when she came in, she's like, you're done. He's like, you're done. And like, he's like, and like, then she brought in a phone and he's like, LA Times. I gotta go to the next one.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. If you want to maybe hold your microphone just slightly. There we go.
How about that?
That's perfect.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
No, good.
Well, I guess we'll just start. I mean, I just think there's a lot to talk about. You explore a lot of nuanced subjects, and while it can start from kind of analyzing far right movements, we can go in so many directions. And I think you and I both have notes. We have ideas. I pull my laptop and we'll look at some stuff. But I mentioned the recent piece you did in Commune Magazine. Really interesting. I know you did a really good podcast with Comrades in Coffee.
No, yeah.
And that was a great interview. I think that one did probably a really good analysis of what you explored in that subject, in that article. But I think in particular, because both of us, explore climate change and stuff like that, I think having you on today and having had that interview earlier today with Dar Jamail, that's fresh in our minds, and of course we're thinking about how our culture, how our particular society, and Western societies in particular, are going to have to deal with, are going to politically and are currently politically dealing with abrupt climate change. Mm-hmm. And it's not going to be this like, oh, let's all come into a state of healing and love. No. I mean, we want that. That's idea. That's what we want. But I mean, in reality, we're going to see, and we are seeing a far right insurgency in many cases. I don't even know. Did you have like a first question you wanted to throw at Shane before I rant at him?
Just a general question is, as I've been exploring your work more and Jason Wilson and Matthew Lyons, is what, at least my interpretation of some of the things I'm seeing with the far right, is that they're there's similar in a sense of people that consider themselves on the left as far as we see something wrong with society, but we have way different things of what we see that's wrong and way different solutions, obviously, or different ways we want to attack it. But there's this inner, I don't know how to, but maybe it's consciously or subconsciously, we know something's not right. And what I worry about and what I realize with listening to Coffee with Comrades, with your interview, with reading Insurgent Supremacists from Matthew Lyons, is that it seems like there's a lot of things that they say that could be anti-establishment, considered that on the surface, and that sucks people into the trap. And as far as they tell a half-truth, like, for instance, I was listening to Dave Rubin, and I was listening to Stefan, what's his last name again?
Stefan Molyneux?
Yeah.
Stefan Molyneux, yeah.
And the way they led the interview was talking about how Hollywood is morally bankrupt, yet they act like they're morally superior. I mean, who doesn't agree with that? A lot of people do. And then next thing you know, 32 minutes later, they're talking about race and IQ and how indigenous people from Australia have the smallest brains and the smallest IQ. I mean, we go from that to something that extreme in about 32-minute segment. So is there things you see when you're doing all this research that you say, that's a trap, don't fall into that trap? We can't let people on the left fall into that trap.
Yeah, I mean, the real thing that I think we should avoid is determining what's useful or what's politically viable based on kind of our gut first instinct, because there's a lot of agreement across people that really doesn't define anything. So like before the podcast started, we were talking about Ron Paul. So like Ron Paul comes out, the Ron Paul revolution, talking about ending the war, talking about vague police state stuff, a little bit against, government interventions. There was, different kind of vague things that most people would agree with. I would agree with. I remember my dad really liking that, thinking, wow, this guy's great. Like, look at what he's saying. But let's really think about what Ron Paul says at his fundamental core. I mean, why is Ron Paul against foreign intervention and conflict? Well, he's against it from an isolationist perspective. Well, I'm not an isolationist. I don't want to just isolate myself off in some kind of economic or civic nationalism. I'm against intervention because it's crushing people of color in the global South. That's not the same reason as Ron Paul. Like I agree with Pat Buchanan that we shouldn't be in X, Y, and Z war, but that's not for the same reason. And so the first thing that someone says there, the first anti-establishment impulse is not necessarily where we find agreement. I don't agree with someone simply because we're both against the state. There's a lot of reasons to be against the state or against capital or to fight your boss. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to do that. But I think it's actually in the more nuance that we find where we actually have agreements in. It's about what the fundamental drives we have, what are our underlying values, and if those are about democracy and equality, they're just fundamentally not the same thing that what Ron Paul feels or what Pat Buchanan feels or definitely what Stefan Molyneux feels.
Yeah, I was going to say, before I really got into the values of, say, Stefan Molyneux, I was watching his videos. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, how it pulls people in from all across the spectrum into their gravity.
Yeah.
Like Stefan Molyneux does a lot of stuff on childhood development, which is super interesting. He talks about, how to in a very real way, talks about the proper way to raise a child in a non-abusive way. Because I think, from what I understand from Stefan Molyneux's perspective, from his life, he himself, I think, was abused as a child. So he has this understandable, concern for how to raise a child in a very, non-coercive way, and kind of going up against some of the common assumptions that people still have about rearing children. Mm-hmm. And I could be wrong on that, but I remember watching some of his videos years ago and being like, this guy's interesting, okay, I agree with that. And then you get into thing you said, I sent you that video of him on the Rubin report, going, and he's like, oh, I just hate that this is the reality. I hate that this is the way it is. Mm-hmm. But people from this and this place with this and this ethnic background and this genetic makeup, they just have lower IQs. And we really need to address that. We have to talk about why, black people are stuck in this rut of poverty. We have to talk about why, and again, he said explicitly in that interview that we're talking about here, it's the bell curve. And you and I talked about that in our first interview together, and that actually, I got some interesting comments, people saying that's not a legitimate argument, and that was a whole other thing. And I messaged you once, I'm like, dude, what are some great critiques that you've seen of the bell curve? Why is that argument, that book or whatever, still such a still used to this day? It's fascinating. I don't know if you had any way to unpack
I mean,
that.
it's still used because people want something to use. If it wasn't the bell curve, they would go to something else. There's a book that came out just a couple of years ago called The Troublesome Inheritance. I don't know if you heard about it. It was actually a pretty popular book by a popular science journalist. And it made essentially a lot of the same arguments that the bell curve did, except it said that personality types and other kinds of factors are created by regionality and recent evolution. So basically, racial differences. They didn't really talk about IQ. They talked about temperamentality and other things. But what people want is they want something that's going to validate these things because they have a gut feeling about it. That gut feeling is implanted by years and years of racist training. But it makes sense to them. So when Stefan Molyneux says that, he's ignoring 95% of research that doesn't prove that. That actually proves that these are really pseudoscientific concepts. The IQ does not develop in that way, and it doesn't signify intelligence in that way. And it's a lot easier then to kind of feed what he's already feeling and to dig into that. The bell curve itself is, I think, we'll look back on with a lot of wonder about how that really came into the public culture and what it really meant. Because what it does is make gigantic leaps about wealth and how societies are created and how societies transfer wealth and sustain themselves based on these really strange psychometric readings. And by using research that's been wholly debunked and been funded by neo-Nazis. And so the question I think is, what is the function of these to people? What are they getting out of them, and why are they ignoring the broad science? Someone like Stefan Molyneux exists in a kind of weird space that couldn't have existed 4 or 5 years ago, before we had internet media that kind of looks good and has the ability to sustain itself financially. And what he does is try and fill a gap that mainstream media, quote unquote, doesn't do, which is creating this kind of alternative viewpoint. And he does that by mining basically alt science and basically, making these arguments that wouldn't fit in any other sphere. So, Stefan Molyneux is not a geneticist. He's not out there talking about, what actual psychometric readings are and how evolutionary science works. Most people would debunk that. Instead, what he is a person that talks at a camera. And that plays really well with a certain subset of his audience because that's what they want. And so the bell curve and all these kind of pseudoscientific arguments work because people want them to work.
It reminds me of it, sorry to interrupt you. No, it's Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is still very popular. I have friends who I love, and they love Jordan Peterson. Yeah. And it gets a little annoying because it's hard to take him seriously when he uses the analogy of lobster hierarchies to kind of justify human hierarchy. Yeah. And it's weird. And his whole argument is that hierarchy is deeper than all of these human systems capitalism, the state, patriarchy, all these things. Those are natural. They come about from a natural evolutionary process. And,
right.
And he tends to ignore the fact that using lobsters is a really weird metaphor. I don't fucking understand the lobster. You could have picked
something
a
Petersonism, yeah.
He could have used something so much better that's so much closer to human beings. He could have at least stayed in the ape, spectrum here, but he didn't. He chose fucking lobsters. Doesn't make sense to me. But I think that these individuals like Stefan Molyneux and Peterson, and we can probably point to all these kind of alt-light, if you could use that for maybe that isn't the right.
I actually think that Peterson, Steven Pinker, there's a number of I think they've been called kind of the intellectual dark web. I think it's a word that's been going around.
Yeah.
That's a good description.
I think of it as the academics that circle around Joe Rogan for some reason.
Yes.
Yep.
And I don't think they're all. I think they're just something else entirely. But they are kind of this cadre of quote unquote dissenting academic, academics for sanity. It's just this crazy PC academic world. If it wasn't for these guys, but again, they fill that kind of space of kind of pseudo intellectualism, or really kind of boiled down intellectualism to this discussion about kind of broad social issues. So like Peterson's not an expert on human social systems. He never claimed to be, yet he's writing these elaborate things about how we should justify hierarchy by looking at shellfish. Like, it's bizarre, but it gets a lot of online views and it gets a huge following. So when he has a Patreon where he's making $500,000 a year, like, it's not really based on being like deep intellectual. It's based on repackaging an intellectual veneer and making really simplistic arguments that appeal to a kind of moderately right base that are just kind of pissed off with the left online.
There was an interview I saw him give, and it was from somebody in England, and maybe it's with the BBC. I don't know. It's the interview that went viral where he watched him slam this woman about how it's okay for gender inequality for pay, and what I noticed is they take that clip as like was like the buzz clip, or for a screenshot in time for people to watch and listen to. But throughout that whole interview, she tried to pin him down on his beliefs, and he kept dancing out of it. He's a guy you cannot pin down. I mean, that's what I find so concerning with some of this stuff, is when you try to have conversations with people like this, is they have a psychological game to it that I would come in with the intention of, here's my ideas, I'm genuinely telling you my ideas, and here's my ideas, here's your ideas, let's let somebody decide what they feel about it. But they're not doing that. There's a manipulation, it's a game to them. It's a game that they must win. Mm-hmm. And I feel like he's one of those people.
I mean, I think there's an advantage for Peterson to dance around what he really believes. I mean, let's put it out there. So he's talking about hierarchy. He's talking about gender differences. That's not that far different from racial differences. And I think that if he was to be totally frank about it, or if he was to go the full measure, he'd be more like Stefan Molyneux, who is not invited to universities to speak, who's not going to sell out, these big venues where he's having these speaking events. And so there's a real advantage to basically stoking the same kind of venom that Molyneux does, but being able to say, like, hey, I'm just talking about social systems, and then, why, and then switch the conversation. Why are you silencing me? Don't you want to have a debate? Let's just have a conversation.
Yeah, and this kind of leads into your article in Commune magazine, A History of Violence. And so just recently, James Alex Fields, he had a trial recently. I think he was convicted for his murder, I believe. I didn't really follow that particular case very closely. I knew about it, of course. But he was the one that was at Charlottesville, was with part of the Unite the Right rally, drove his car into a crowd of people, killed Heather Hare, and now is on trial for that. And from what I understand, that the trial, or the various charges against him, that hasn't been fully concluded yet. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the question of civil rights violations and terrorism charges. I would have to go back and look at what the federal prosecution actually looks like, but it could result in enhancements. And so I don't think the conversation is over. I think it's about a debate about whether there's life in prison or if death penalty is on the table. I'd have to go look at the specifics of it, but it's about that.
Okay. And what you did in that piece is you discussed the complex, I guess, of these individuals. I mean, he's not the first person who's been, I guess you could say, radicalized, or maybe that's not the right word, but as a part of this sort of, he's considered a lone wolf, right? Mm-hmm. This idea of this person who was mentally unstable or something, he was drawn to the movement. He didn't really have any real associations with any of the major groups that were at the rally. And while there is certainly defenders that would say that, he was being intimidated by the crowd that was surrounding his car, he was acting as, maybe it's irrational, but he did something that made sense in a certain kind of way. We see this over and over again, and that's what you did a really good job in this piece, is just you get into the pattern of these things. And if you don't mind, I would like to quote something from that piece, just to get some context here. It says, there exists a reliable pattern inside of American white nationalism. Rising to visibility through hot-button issues, fascists will see a moment of skyrocketing influence and use it to latch onto a slightly more moderate right-wing movement so as to gain influence and recruit. During the civil rights movement, racialists, and the Ku Klux Klan used the pro-segregationist movement and the white citizens' councils to gain respectability with Jim Crow Southerners and to expand the Overton window with regards to race. in the 1880s, it was paleoconservatism, a more old right version of republicanism that rejected the internationalist and neoliberal neoconservatism that gave the extreme right access to the conservative base, particularly through figures like Pat Buchanan. More recently, it has been the internet celebrity cadre of civic nationalists, often referred to as the alt-right, consisting of people like Jack, is it Posobiec? Posobiec, thank you. Milo Yiannopoulos, Alex Jones, and Lauren Southern. Open fascism is generally seen as contemptible by most of the public when presented on its own. With a friendlier partner, however, fascists can slowly normalize their politics and grow their ranks. So I know we were just sort of talking about these, like, kind of, they're not particularly necessarily fit within the alt-right or alt-right, especially. But I do think, like we were discussing like earlier before the recording, like people getting into libertarianism, for instance, with, say, a Ron Paul election, or a Ron Paul presidential election campaign, excuse me. This doesn't necessarily lead to, say, joining the militia movement. This doesn't necessarily mean they're going to join some alt-right group, some white supremacist group. But again, if you kind of dig into it a little bit, you see how that's a gateway for a lot of people, I could see.
Yeah.
And maybe that's saying a lot for some of these people. Like, I don't think people that like Jordan Peterson necessarily are going to jump on the, Richard Spencer bandwagon anytime soon. But you pointed to in that essay, in that article, there's a particular pattern within the alt-right and far-right movements. They legitimize their presence by latching onto less extreme versions of basically what they believe.
Right.
And yeah, if you just wanted to kind of unpack what I kind of quoted there.
Yeah. I mean, radical movements in general kind of need to do this. There has to be some way of bridging in. It really depends on how they see themselves functioning. And the alt-right is confused in a lot of ways. Are they a revolutionary movement? Are they one that wants to get electoral reforms? So do they, want to go step by step? Do they want catastrophic events? It's always like kind of unsure. But what they do want more than anything is to speak to people, to change minds, to scrape people off the surface who are ready to go, and to move other people along. And so what they do is the same thing that white nationalist groups have done for decades, which is to find something that has common cause with them and to kind of move through them. So if you look at the Klan that had what I mean is the third era Klan of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. This is really that came about in the South as almost a paramilitary movement against desegregation, especially in the Deep South. And what it needed was some way to connect with other people. So outside of North Carolina, it didn't really have huge numbers. And so what it needed to do was basically find a way of pushing a really militant pro-segregationist message into the mainstream, and it did that by allying with white citizens councils, basically community groups that were concerned citizens against desegregation. That was a way of essentially mainstreaming their ideas of a really militant Jim Crow. And this happens again in stages throughout the years. Now, once you hit about the late 70s and 80s, there's definitely a shift in the white power movement to being a little bit more openly revolutionary, but there's still a large portion of it that needs that crossover thing. They have to be able to speak to people. And they do that by coding it as issues of immigration, issues of Islam more recently, issues of PC culture, feminism, multiculturalism, affirmative action. There's all these sorts of things, and they can really hone in on them. Starting in the 90s, it was really heavily focused on immigration, and they did that by really trying to tap into people who are already kind of edgy in their views, and that was people associated with libertarianism, libertarian parties, and things like that, and people like Ron Paul. And so today, there's a lot of anxiety over Islam. There's a lot of anxiety about immigration in large parts of the country, and they're able to just continually stoke that. And when you make immigration such a prime issue for people, when they become like quote unquote a single issue voter, like Ann Coulter likes to say about immigration, then why wouldn't you be a white nationalist? Because really what you're doing is fundamentally creating an entire political identity centered on keeping people who aren't like you out, and that's very, very mobilizing for people. And so when you focus in on that almost entirely, you're able to push almost the exact same worldview with different branding and different tribal affiliations. And so that's what they're able to do. And when you're able to do that, their movement isn't that far off, and it's able to make gains. And they have made gains just by doing that. In a way, what they were trying to enter moved even further past them. Like those movements became so much more radical, they didn't even need the white nationalists anymore. They're just like blasting forward at this point.
And so one thing I wanted to ask you is, you're seeing really what you're tracing for us is a cycle of rebranding to come back. I mean, in the 90s, from what I remember reading, was the decade they really got pushed down. And now they've come back, and now we're at a stage where Gavin McInnes has left the Proud Boys. The Unite the Right 2 march, not even, was a failure.
Total.
And Richard Spencer can't get speaking gigs at colleges anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So where are they? Where do things stand now with the movement?
It's totally unsure, but I mean, unless there's some movement that actually crush it really effectively, I mean, it will just come back. Maybe even then. I mean, it's part and parcel for the underlying conditions of the society we live in. So it's not like we can just completely eradicate it without doing really, really fundamental work on changing society. But yeah, they're in a really bad spot right now. They've had really mass resistance to them. They've also done it to themselves. They were deplatformed themselves essentially by being such large buffoons and murderous assholes. Like they were so effectively deplatformed that their media infrastructure, which really gave them a huge boost, is gone. Richard Spencer, as a figurehead, was getting shut down so regularly, also having his own interpersonal problems, I'm sure didn't help anything. And so yeah, they're really in a lot of disarray. What's scary about that, they have these peaks and troughs all the time, like pretty much like any social movement in a way. This was a huge peak for them, but they are falling off that cliff very, very quickly, and that's when you see acts of like seemingly spontaneous violence. It's when desperate people who have been given essentially a revolutionary imperative, they have to do this, right? Immigration and white genocide create this kind of frantic response. Oh my God, we have to stop this. Oh my God, our society is going to fall apart. We're going to be eliminated. You give them that, and then you give them no way forward because their movements failed. And so that's when you see the kind of catastrophic acts of violence. How they rebrand, it's really hard to say. The far right or radical right that's not just explicit white nationalists, those associated with Trump and other kind of far right outlets, Breitbart, they're doing just fine. Like they will continue forward. It's the explicit white nationalists that took the major hit, and the slightly more moderate far right kept going. So it's hard to see what the branding will look like. It could be that they brand more revolutionary, that it goes more back to the white power roots. It could be that they really double down on the Stefan Molyneux type of trying to make it about media talking points and these more moderate outlets. But it's really hard to say at this point.
One question I wanted to ask you, and I thought you did a great job when I listened to the interview of Coffee with Comrades, is this dance that they do where they're the victim. They're through multiculturalism, they're the victim, but yet at the same time, it's this genetics that makes them superior. Mm-hmm. So how do they balance that to get people to tap into that kind of dance and that message that they're giving?
Oh, Jews. I mean, Jews are the answer to their unfinished equation. Nothing makes sense. Andrew Anglin and Greg Johnson, who runs Countercurrents Publishing, it's a big white nationalist kind of more like intellectual publishing house. They'll say it. This makes no sense. Nothing we're saying makes any sense without Jews. Jews are the answer to that question. And so what they're basically saying is that as history goes on, it's the battle between nations and peoples. That's just normal parts of, species fight other species for hegemony and survival. And white people, as superior as they are, always won. That was until Jews get in there with their tribal interest and their very high verbal IQs, and they're able to use the genetic gifts that whites had against themselves. So whites have a high trust society, they'll often say. This is something Stefan Molyneux even talks about. This is part of the kind of intellectual pseudoscience, that they're able to, create these societies where they trust people, where they're able to, therefore, create, advancements in science and things like that, except Jews will turn that against them, trick them, and therefore they'll use it against them. And they do that with multiculturalism, liberalism, feminism, Freudian psychology. I mean, honestly, over the eras, it changes somewhat, but no matter what the question is, the answer is Jews tricked white people.
Which is why, going back to Dave Rubens' YouTube video, that he said the smartest ethnicity was Jewish people, and that, and particularly in verbal IQ.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, I mean, the bell curve says the same thing. Ashkenazi Jews are the smartest.
Yeah. Well, what is the response then to someone who says that? Because I'm not saying that I agree with that, but what I'm kind of asking, I guess, is if you have a test, an IQ test or whatever metrics they're using, and they may be completely valid scientific measurements. I could be wrong on saying that, but I don't know. I'm just saying, like, if there is a say scientific measurement that shows that certain groups of people test higher on certain, say, there's certain acuity, like they're better at certain things, like verbally they're better, like you're just describing the Jews, right? And of course that could be twisted in so many ways. So again, I guess I'm asking is, like, what would be a real scientist, I guess, that isn't trying to cherry pick the data? What would they say is the reason for these discrepancies, the differences between certain groups of people?
It's a huge range. I should limit the amount I get into it versus like what a geneticist or a psychiatrist would likely answer on some of those things. But there's a number of them. The first thing is that IQ is not a really great measurement of natural intelligence. There is some validity in measuring the naturalness of people's ability to recognize patterns, to solve abstract problems and things like that. But IQ can be generally affected by education levels, by access to nutrition, by a huge number of factors. There's really dramatic cultural differences in how people solve the problems and things that are presented by IQ tests. And so IQ tests, I know that what kind of racists like to do is try and say that there's nonverbal IQ tests that show the same results. It's not true. And the reality is that people with a substantial graduate education, for example, score really high on IQ tests and scored low on them before that education. People that don't speak English tend to score much lower on those IQ tests, even when they're translated. There's a lot of things that kind of go into what the IQ test measures. When we're talking about the IQ tests that people generally ascribe to Ashkenazi Jews, they're talking about studies of testing basically Jewish graduate students with super high IQs, and then looking at psychometric data from Africa, from people that don't speak English and were just introduced with IQ tests quite often, and then trying to compare those results. It just doesn't actually make sense. And also, I think what's really important too, when we're looking at what they say about IQ tests, is how they explain these discrepancies. And so, for example, J. Philippe Rushton, who was a really kind of big proponent of race and IQ, offers this idea that white people, because of cold climate, evolved to be much smarter problem solvers versus people in Africa, which totally kind of, if anyone's compared what Sweden is like, geographically to Central or Sub-Saharan Africa, not exactly like one is just the hard place to live and the other one's just super easy. It really doesn't put into calculation about how IQ is formed, how intelligence would be formed cognitively, how people solve problems, and it really undervalues any kind of form of social science and how it would actually explain how people develop culturally. So I think when we're looking at something like an IQ test, what is it really measuring, and how do we understand those kind of complexes today? It's very dramatically different.
Yeah, it just seems like the IQ test is the only thing they're basing this on, right? I mean, is there other like metrics that they're basing it on, or is it?
I mean,
just
even more pseudoscientific things like criminality. For example, if you look back in the period of eugenics, there was this idea that criminality was like a character flaw that could be explained genetically. Now we understand what criminality has to do with social conditions, what society expect of individuals, what their socioeconomic background is, what people do to survive, how they understand themselves, their identities, all kinds of things. And so when they look at those sorts of things, what they want to do is say that a certain type of personality comes from a certain region. Therefore, we can generalize pretty, matter-of-factly. But the reality is that's not the case. There is no temperance or IQ that can be ascribed to any group of people. There is no scientific evidence of that. There is some minor scientific evidence about, families and maybe they score on a certain kind of rating. Even that's really highly adjustable based on their education, on their environmental factors, on how they were raised and things like that. But no, there really isn't any substantial information otherwise. And a lot of the tests and studies that, for example, were cited by the bell curve and are cited quite often were funded by essentially white nationalist funds, like the Pioneer Fund, was formed in the 30s, basically to fund race science education. And so we're talking about in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, studies like, for example, twin studies, which are supposed to compare the high heritability of IQ, was funded by this basically Nazi research tank, and then that was uncritically used by a lot of people like Charles Murray and the bell curve. And we're talking about basically studies that are highly debunked, that are not used in any academic paper by professors who speak at American Renaissance. So when we look at like what we think we know about IQ and how it affects societies, we're talking about really highly compromised research that's not generally accepted by anyone.
I know we were talking about, some of the theories that they have on brain size and particularly IQ, but what about DNA? I mean, I know that there was recently in the news, there's James Watson who he discovered the structure of DNA, who's come out and said about intelligence levels with race and with white people compared to African people. Have they gone into as far as in depth on have they used his rhetoric to justify their beliefs, and also have they talked about DNA as a way?
So, I mean, they use James Watson a lot as the image of the embattled professor. He's just trying to speak truth, guys, and apparently that's illegal these days. That's essentially how they treat James Watson. James Watson is a brilliant man, in terms of sequencing the human genome and looking at the structure of DNA. There's no question of it. And it takes someone that smart to say something so fabulously stupid as what he said, which isn't based on any research he's ever done. It's his assumptions as a geneticist that so many things have to have a genetic root that he takes essentially a racial bias and gives it a deep thought explanation. And so, recently, this happened in 2007 in an interview. He basically said that Africa had gloomy prospects because of their low IQ, which he thought was genetic. And so then fast forward, PBS is doing a documentary about scientific masters, I think. So it's basically looking at his career and how he's always been kind of an asshole. That's kind of the story, because this isn't the only time he said stuff like this. And then when they ask him, do you still think that? He's like, yeah, I do still think that. I still think that it's genetic. I'm sorry. And so, he's had kind of even more of his titles stripped from him in the Research Institute, where he did a lot of his genomic research.
That just fucks with, I think, a lot of people and how they view intelligence itself, because you have a person like him. He's a geneticist. He did groundbreaking scientific research with a couple other people, right? Won the Nobel Prize, like all this shit, all these credentials, right? It also reminds me, I think I was talking to my friend the other day about this, Ben Carson, who ran for president the last election. What is he, a neurosurgeon or something?
The best in the country.
Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, he is unparalleled in science. If I had brain surgery, I would want it to be Ben Carson.
And that's what fucks with me, because he still believes in this, biblical creation story thing, and he, says some of the most, sexist shit. It's just
some of the most buffoonish things I've ever heard
Pull
about
yourself
history.
up by your bootstraps, too. He's a big one on that.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. And it's so perplexing. I think it fucks with us, and this, to me, is why I think we shouldn't be using IQ to indicate, obviously, we shouldn't obviously equate it with morality. That's definitely not the case. But especially, in certain kinds, I feel like intelligence is really a mosaic or a spectrum of things. It's not like, okay, you have a really high IQ. That means you understand all these different components of society and how societies are structured and what's best for a cult. You know what I mean? That's what I think fucks with people, and me too. I get a little caught up in this idea of, if there's a test that proves someone's super intelligent, they're the best neurosurgeon in the country, they must understand that the Bible is not the best place to look for the evolutionary history of mankind or humankind, right?
Right.
You know what I mean? It gets weird.
But I think it reminds us that just because someone is a fantastic neuroscience doesn't mean that they can teach me about Egyptian history, Yeah. Because Ben Carson, I mean, while he may be brilliant when it comes to his surgical techniques, I mean, is falling for some of the most bizarre and silly explanations about history.
Well, earlier today we were talking about shit. I'm sorry, I'm blanking right now. I'm having a hard time with my brain right now. Fuck. You go ahead. I'll try to remember what I was going to say.
What I think this all speaks to is a failure in our education system. I think that we're an education system that we're designed to take a test and do well at a test. Right. And not critically think, and we're designed to be specialists. And that's exactly what Ben Carson is.
You just said everything. Yes.
He's a specialist in brain surgery, but just because he's a specialist in brain surgery doesn't mean he's a specialist in other areas. And that goes across the board for anybody.
Yeah, highly specialized forms of education. I guess that's what I was going to say. I totally blanked on that. But yeah, specialization, especially in a kind of a capitalist society like our own, where people, like for instance, we don't know how to live off the land. We don't have to, but we survive in this society and culture is like, I'm very good at making coffee and I'm going to be a barista. I'm very good. I went to school for 8 to whatever amount of years to be a neurosurgeon. I'm very, very, very specialized in this thing. Trying to then use that kind of specialized intelligence to try to understand other complex things in the world doesn't always carry over.
Yeah, because I think there's a lack of, I really hate to say critical thinking because it sounds so kind of insulting when you say, but there is a certain inability to kind of differentiate between quality information and unquality, at the same time as having a dramatic distrust in institutions, which frankly is probably well-deserved, right? And so when you're looking at something like Stefan Molyneux having a video about IQ, like, I don't know. I guess it sounds right. There's a bunch of sciencey sounding word. He has a thorough line, It makes sense when he's saying it. The problem is it's untrue, right? And I don't have the resources really to decode that. I don't really understand that IQ really measures a whole bunch of experiences. Some of them cognitive, some of them, having to do with, what kind of education I had and how I'm feeling right then. There's a whole range of things that go into that. I don't really know about that. He's saying it's something that's patentable and measurable, and he's citing these scientists for it. And I think that's true about, kind of the world of conspiracy theories that's only growing, where it's an attempt to really make sense of the world, but not having a really clear picture of how these different systems work.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask, I think this is to kind of get back into, I guess, the far right and how they, I think you pointed this in previous interviews you've had, and I think you pointed the interview you did with Comrades and Coffee, but the fact is that, at least for me, and I talked about this whole Ron Paul thing when I was a kid, that was a big deal. That was a libertarian perspective. Free market capitalism is like the best system ever, and that's the epitome of freedom, right? So I think we have, at least for me and people that are, I guess, of a leftist tendency, tend to think leftists are the only ones that are critiquing capitalism, the only ones that think in an anti-capitalist fashion about these things. And what you point to, and you've pointed to in that previous interview I mentioned, is actually when you get into white supremacist territory, like this ethno-state kind of dream that a lot of these guys have, they are anti-capitalist, but in a completely different way. If you could, I would love if you could unpack that.
Yeah, there's this term that got floated around kind of academically that didn't pick up, but I actually really liked it. It's called right-wing socialism. So, like, what do we think of when we say socialism? Well, on the left, we understand it to kind of mean a form of egalitarian social systems, control over the workplace, horizontaling of society. But there's a certain kind of vision of socialism as a horizontaling for a particular people for a particular purpose. And so, like, not to be cute about it, but National Socialism being the socialism for a particular nation. So, okay, we're going to kind of support the German people. What can we do to empower them, to make them stronger, to feel better, to live better? And in a lot of ways, what fascism is a critique on capitalism and existing liberal society by saying it doesn't meet the goals that it's promised. And instead, we're going to kind of offer a new system, one that both kind of validates right-wing impulses towards inequality, but at the same time, really going against the cosmopolitan multicultural world that is also a part of international capitalism. So if the left opposes capitalism because it creates inequality, the right's going to oppose it because it doesn't really create the right formalized inequality. And so instead, their vision of society is one where there's certain people on the top rightfully, certain people on the bottom by virtue of birth, genetics or otherwise, and you really need to kind of stratify that intentionally. And so they really have a much more complex vision for how the world should be structured than kind of the chaos of capitalism can allow, or the kind of ups and downs of markets, or the accumulation of wealth simply for reasons of having capital. And so that's sort of, in a lot of ways, where the far-right vision of anti-capitalism comes from. It also comes from the fact that capitalism creates such dramatic instability and crisis that fascism is the answer to. And so they come at it in a lot of ways from the same impulse that the left does, from reacting to kind of these moments of crisis, from a lot of sense of precarity, of systems falling apart and that kind of thing, and trying to create a solution for it. And if you look at capitalism existing and understand that neoliberalism sort of tearing at the environment, like we talked about, tearing at social systems, breaking up the family and things like that, things that they care really dramatically about, then they want to find a counter to that. And they have a large version of that. And I think one of the things that has to be understood about fascism, the alt-right, white nationalism in the U.S., even if a lot of those people come out of libertarianism, the only way they come this far is that they leave a large portion of that behind. And that's really a pathway for them. There's a lot of kind of implicit racialism and a lot of libertarianism, but when it becomes explicit, they have to leave certain parts of that behind, because there's a certain mythology that exists in libertarianism and about capitalism, that it's fair, it's equal, everyone's treated the same. And they're totally not just getting rid of the capitalist part, but they're getting rid of the mythology. They don't want to pretend that people are going to be treated fairly anymore.
There was something I wanted to get your thoughts on. I've been reading a lot of Anthony DiMaggio's work, and he wrote an article for Counterpunch, and it's called "The Shutdown as Fascist Creep Profiling Right-Wing Extremism in America." And he did a bunch of polling, and he took poll results. He also, I think, did some polling, and some of the things that he found out through the polling was that he just named off a couple things, that it was more like some of these fascist ideologies are more like hyper neoliberalism, as opposed to, it's not this myth of blue collar workers. It's more people that are in good standing. And one of the things he says is for contempt for checks and balances between the branches of government was accompanied by 26% increased likelihood of supporting Trump, and it was 33% increased likelihood in 2017. Embracing violence against perceived enemies was associated with 11% increased likelihood of supporting Trump. Contempt for media freedom was associated with a 33% greater likelihood of being a Trump supporter, and so on. But what he ultimately did was add up kind of these fascist ideologies, like fascist ideals, and he found that there could be an amounting to a staggering 20 to 25 million Americans that embrace fascist policies.
I think he's wrong. I just, there's a certain line of thinking about fascism on the left that often ascribes it to totalitarian power or simply to kind of dictatorial power, especially when it comes to neoliberal capital, which was really the hyper-centralization of capital internationally, and looking at things like the government shutdown and then saying, this strong man that's creating such economic and social crisis, therefore has this element of a fascist movement to it. And I just have trouble seeing that through line. One of the things that's really important to understand about fascism is that it solves a lot of problems economically for a large portion of the population. So when he says the myth of the white working class as an agent of fascism, the white working class is an agent of fascism, because fascism is in of itself a form of class struggle. It's a form of them kind of
myself on that. He wrote an article saying that, based off the polling data that he pulled, was that so much of the mainstream media was saying it was the white working class that elected Trump, where really it was not the white working class.
I actually take a little bit. So I know what polls, but people are talking about, and they often try and point to that Trump supporters are actually quite more affluent than they're portrayed. That's important. That's true. I think if we look at a broad understanding of class as the working class of people who don't own and control capital, even working professionals that are supporting Trump, I think would be considered a part of the white working class broadly. And so I don't want to get bogged down too much in like what exact levels of income and things like that. I think a lot of people do when looking historically and trying to understand how fascism arises. Is it from the middle class? Is it from the artisanal class? I think instead would rather look broadly at white people who are non-rich and what exactly they're kind of engaging in. And what we look at something like Trump, or we look at like a more fully fledged fascist movement, is that large portions of white workers do that against their better interests because they're given, kind of meek promises like, okay, we'll kind of put you above other workers, basically non-white workers or workers from marginalized groups. And so that's really, really important, because what that creates is a mass populist movement. And fascism really rules not just by dictatorial power, but by the mass participation of people. And so that those are the kind of moments that I have a bit of a break, because one of the things that's really important is that fascism would, if it was to be kind of fully fledged in the U.S., and we say like, yeah, this is really what we understand to be a fascist state, it would inevitably undermine parts of neoliberalism, because that chaos of capital isn't command, it's not controlled, and it's not being controlled for a subset identity of people. And that's really, really necessary. And so in a way, the neoliberalism creates kind of the impetus for Trump to then favor workers, except right now he's kind of favoring nobody.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I think it is interesting when you actually break down fascism, because I think it often it isn't what actually a lot of people on the right really want. Do you know what I mean? Like they do want maybe elements of it. There's elements of it that shine through. They're like, okay, that definitely has elements of fascism, but at least in the United States, it's not quite what we maybe often attribute to it. It may be nationalistic, it may be white supremacist, it may be all these things, but it isn't fascism in the proper sense.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what kind of fucks with people's head a little bit, because it's really easy to call someone a fascist,
It is, As someone who's written about fascism a lot, I actually cringe a lot when saying it, because it's used so diversely,
liberally.
Yeah, right. And it's like I came up during the years of Bush, where it was described constantly. Bush is a lot of things. A fascist, he's not. That's just not what the word means. And so I think it becomes really difficult when we're trying to look at what would a fascist movement take place, or how would a fascist movement take place, I should say, and who would the people be? What would they say? What would they think? And I actually think it ends up being a lot different and a lot more subtle than we normally expect it to be. And it takes place in moments of really extreme crisis, where it draws on a lot of the same influences as the left does, except on a very specific subset of the population, which are essentially being bought out.
So do you think that, this is what I hear a lot of people on the left say too, is all the mechanisms are in place, you just need to flip a switch and we're going to be in fascism, like for instance with this government shutdown. If Donald Trump would have declared a national emergency to build the wall, I've read from a lot of people that I respect them saying we've reached fascism when that happens.
I think we should back away from that a little bit, because whether or not that is fascism, or the next stage is fascism, or the one after that is, I think we can say where we're at is pretty fucking awful, and we can do something about it now, So yeah, I mean, as people organize to counter Trump, anything should be done to stop the wall. That's great. If he successfully does that, then people should organize and kind of confront the existence of the wall. And whether or not that really is the dividing line, I don't think we should get too wrapped up in that, because resisting that and, large issues of basically neoliberal capital, massive wealth inequality, climate collapse, all of those should be on the agenda all the time. And I don't want to use one kind of target idea or target date or something like that as saying like, yeah, that's the time when we reached it. That's the time when things change, that kind of thing. It's changing all the time, and it's not really changing for the better. So I think we start now. We say that those things are, possibilities, though that the world could be dramatically worse years from now if we don't intervene. But I think it's important to just say, like, we are going to kind of be no holds barred in our organizing now and approach it now without worrying too much about exactly what, if the next stage is going to be kind of full-fledged fascism or not.
Yeah, like you said, it may not fit under the definition of capitalism, fascism. Excuse me, under fascism, but it's still fucking horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, this whole government shutdown. I have been really disturbed by it. I think there was an article that came out recently, and it was asking I think it was Daily Beast or something, but they were asking like, are anarchists, leftist anarchists, are they happy about the government shutdown? They're like, no. Like
You're right.
Yeah, like why would we be? This isn't what we're talking about, you know. And I think this idea that okay, there's a government shutdown, this is gonna lead to some sort of real resistance or something. It doesn't seem like, at least from my perspective, I mean, I don't see anything really coming out of it except obviously there's resentment, there's anger, there's frustration. It does highlight the economic situations that a lot of Americans are in, living paycheck to paycheck. If you work for the TSA and you're not getting, I mean, TSA sucks, obviously, for a lot of reasons, but workers are not getting their paychecks. Right. National parks are not being taken care of. People are treating those lands terribly because they're not being managed appropriately or well anymore. I think this government shutdown thing is, you know, I do wonder like how different political strains and trends within the country are going to interpret these types of actions by the U.S. government under Trump. What is your kind of analysis, I guess, of what's currently unfolding under the government shutdown?
I mean, to me, it looks like the kind of absurdity of capital in a way. There's really no benefit here. It costs more money in the end, subtotal. We're talking about over 800,000 people without jobs right now. That's not popular amongst his base. It's not popular amongst the left. It's not popular amongst anybody. I think the Beast article is kind of right on the money. Large parts of the left that are critical of the state don't see this as the absence of the state, because it's not. All the problems of the state are there. It's just a bunch of people don't have jobs, that forests are getting messed up. I mean, like, that's what it really comes down to. Critiques of the state are much more involved because it gets back to our underlying values and how we want a complete reshaping of society. There's no reshaping of society except that people who normally have jobs are waiting in line to get camp food now.
Yeah.
And don't you think a lot of people on the left, and I'm not talking about like an anarchist perspective, but just people on the left, it's the critique of the administration of those services by the state, that we'd like maybe things a little bit distributed differently, or it's not that we don't want the services at all. And I think that's where you're pointing to that article where people are upset. I mean, these are things that a lot of people rely on, including, you know, us. So of course we want some of these things in place, and maybe just have an honest conversation about how they're administered or how they're provided to people.
I mean, there's a sort of political volatility to social services where they really fundamentally change. And so if you look at the National Park Service, for a long time was really pushing forward on making them the vanguard of dealing with climate change, making it a public issue, but also finding ways of managing it, managing resources, managing spaces. Those have become really politically volatile in a different way, you know, and have actually been used as kind of a new vanguard against talking about climate change, or kind of stigmatizing the discussion of climate change. So in a way, those social services have been kind of politicized away. I think that what we're looking at is the shutdown of the elements of the state that we have basically fought to put there. So National Park Service, things that we really, really value, those are the things that are actually coming under attack. Police departments are not coming under attack. Things that people really find victimizing aren't really coming under attack. ICE is funded. And so I think when we're looking at something like the government shutdown, they really ends up only existing as one that affects the people and not the infrastructure of the state that are incredibly problematic. I don't find anything particularly useful about the government shutdown. It's really, really hard on workers. It's hard on the unions that are representing those workers. And so I find it to be, in all possible ways, just kind of undermining. But because of that, there's a large portion of workers who are already organized in the unions and that are really fundamental to society that can actually find a moment of power here in resisting to go to work and finding ways of challenging their workplaces, of taking that power back, of being very vocal about it in doing so. And so I think that there's a huge advantage into those workers thinking of themselves as workers affected by basically a shitty boss, which is what it is.
What do you think because I don't think it's really, I mean, it is partly, I imagine, there is a real symbolic importance of building a wall, right? A border wall, maybe. I don't know. Probably a lot that could be said about that. But as Dar was saying this morning when we were interviewing Dar Jamali, it's like this is a political tool that's being used by Trump, by the Trump administration. What do you think is the goal of it? I find it perplexing. I haven't sat and thought about it a whole lot. I don't know what your thoughts are on like why now especially. He could have gotten. I think he may have been more likely to get funding under a Republican Congress, maybe, possibly.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, now we have more of a Democratic control of the Congress, right? So I don't know. It's interesting, right? I mean, what is the? Because I always feel a lot of it is a lot. I don't think people give Trump enough credit as far as being very calculated in some of his decisions. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think there is a certain thing. He understands public relations.
Yeah, and he understands branding really well.
Yep.
And the wall is great branding for him. It works really well.
It's like that thing with the because of the government shutdown, he had all those cheeseburgers from all those fast food restaurants.
Right.
That was something, that I think people were like insulted by, but at the same time, I'm like, he knew what he was doing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think with that stuff, he's really intuitive about it.
And
with the wall is two things. It's his brand, right? Build the wall. People loved that on his campaign trail because it allowed them to say all the things that they had wanted to say and do it all under a politically viable kind of covert language. But it's also a campaign promise, and it's one that was so lofty. It's a big campaign promise. And it's one that I think now it's being called to deliver on it. He won't really have a base without the wall. The wall, rhetorically and politically, is his base. That's the fundamentals of what got him elected. So he knows he's going to need that coming up in 2020, and so he has to do something on it. He also got elected by being a strong man. So he thinks that, hey, if I just go in there and I kick some ass and I kind of force him to do that, then that'll also look good. The problem is that federal workers are also part of his base. So, like, it's a really difficult spot he gets put into. So he sees this, and it worked in the past. If he just sticks to things, he refuses to apologize, he just says, fuck it, I'm going to do it anyway, it worked. It's why wouldn't it work this time? He didn't listen to advisors before, and it worked. He didn't listen to the media and every political pundit, and he won. Why would he listen this time? So I think there's a certain amount of, like, he's playing through what's won in the past, what he kind of knows to be true in some place, and he's trying to play it to its logical conclusion. The problem is he's overshooting it, I think, as far as we can tell, that this is really going to affect his popularity with his base, especially when we're talking about people who aren't going to get government services that are going to be part of, like, the lower income areas of his base in the the middle America and the South.
Yeah, I'm just having a hard time seeing how this is all going to play out. I mean, because he's like a game of chicken a little bit.
I think if I was to predict, and I'm bad at predicting, if I was to predict, it would be a slow incremental restarting of the government. 1% at a time. In a way, I don't know if that's. I mean, I want people to get their jobs back, so I'm always happy when that happens. But I think that can help kind of erase exactly what he's doing, which is really catastrophic for a lot of people. And by slowly introducing it, it starts to take the heat off of him a little bit. And that's what he's done a little bit, is by allowing certain parts of the government to basically start functioning again that could take some of that heat off. But then a certain segment that's not really affecting his base is going to keep going. And so, yeah, I think we're going to see the slow kind of reopening of it. But I don't know what that's going to do for his wall promise.
It was the main promise in his campaign, and like you said, it's something that once you've put that out there so much, you can't take it back. You have to hold strong. How are you not going to deliver on your big promise that's getting people riled up to chant this? And now we're seeing in the news with Nathan Phillips, the indigenous activist, the Native American, who they were chanting, these people from Covington High School were chanting, build the wall. And we know that means a bunch of different things. And it's a symbol of white nationalism, right?
Oh.
And we've seen that on display.
Yeah. So we're a few days out from it, right? So we first see these videos of these kids. There is no one that didn't have like a giant gut reaction to these like entitled rich kids with their MAGA hats mocking an indigenous elder there's no one that didn't have that reaction. And now a lot of publications are trying to backtrack on the original coverage in light of the larger video, which I don't think exonerates those kids even in the
I don't
slightest.
think so either.
I can't wrap my head around why there's the kind of softening of this. This is one of the ugliest things that we've seen in kind of the Trumpian years that's like an easy video to watch online. It's all kind of like an entire narrative, an entire history, an entire kind of way of being is kind of wrapped up in this video. The image of very entitled, rich white kids smugly wearing their MAGA hats and dancing around doing tomahawk hand gestures just to mock this person. It's all wrapped up right there. And so I think our anger is justified.
Yeah, and I think Vic Berger, he does a lot of obviously very satirical, weird videos, right, where he mocks Trump with these, and I think they're very well made videos. They're hilarious. He does a great job of editing. I don't know if you've ever seen a Vic Berger
video.
Yeah,
he's great.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. But occasionally he'll do that. He did one on Gavin McInnes back when he was still the leader of the Proud Boys. He'll dig into all the archive, all the videos, and he'll lay it out. And I think he did an excellent job with this video he just came out, where he took all the videos that were taken, and shows what happened. Like he shows when those what are they? These black Israelite. What are they called? I don't want to say
black Hebrew Israelites. Yeah.
And they're like, they're being belligerent as they usually are to this group, and that kind of created these tensions. And then Nathan Phillips shows up and he's drumming and he walks towards them, and even within all of that, with the whole context of the videos, everything shown from beginning to end, it still shows Nathan Phillips as not being the instigator of this at all. And what's even creepier is now, like, when, of course, people are kind of backing off of it a little bit, which is, whatever. But the other thing is, because, this kid, the smug, smirky kid, right? He's got a rich family, right? Mm-hmm. He had this statement probably concocted in great degree by a family lawyer.
By a PR firm. That was hired. Yeah.
Even worse.
I hate to be just so smug and cynical, but you read the statement, and I'm like, I'm sorry, a 16-year-old kid in a MAGA hat did not write that statement.
Yeah, no, well, definitely. And again, it does show this, it kind of shows, I know this is maybe a big statement, and maybe I shouldn't say it, but it kind of shows what America is in a lot of ways. Maybe I'm wrong in saying that, but obviously it's an incredibly complex thing, America as a thing. But I think that's why it struck that gut feeling, because I woke up in the morning, and I think a lot of us wake up and look at our cell phones, unfortunately, and we read the first thing, and I saw that video, and I was like, I'm gonna cry. Like, I don't know what it was, it just hit me. I was like, this is fucked up.
It is violent rage that kind of swept the country when seeing this.
Yeah.
I get it though. I think there's been this commentary that it's unfair to put our kind of a sort of traumatic history with kids that look like them onto those kids. Yeah. And I understand that.
Totally.
The problem is that they are a part of that traumatic history now, right? Like, they actually are in doing those sorts of things. And so as they dance around, as they mock these folks trying to have an Indigenous Peoples Day, trying to share culture, share their experiences, and as they do it with this kind of the entitled smugness that kind of gives us that gut reaction, it's really a sign of something that's institutional, right? They have the money to do this. They come from a really institutionally supportive background.
They were bussed in, right?
Yeah, for Kentucky.
A quote. I say pro-life with quotations around it, but a pro-life rally.
Right? Yeah, for Right to Life, a massively ugly, destructive event meant to basically marginalize women's health.
Yeah.
Wearing hats, which I think are fairly signs of white supremacy at this point. They're not even signs of Trump support. The MAGA hat is far beyond that. Yeah. They're chanting MAGA at women passing by. You can see cell phone videos of that. So whether or not they approached the crowd or they were just standing there, it really doesn't matter. They still danced around and laughed, and like, at this point, what do we really need to be tolerant of? I walk through my life trying to be forgiving and kind to all kinds of people. Do I really need to go step out for that? Do we culturally need to really jump through hoops to forgive these kids?
Yeah.
Like, I think that there's a lot of work that has to be done on that side.
And this whole thing about, it seemed like they were triggered by these black Israelites. But unfortunately, when you look at videos before that confrontation, if you want to call it a confrontation, but before them shouting at one another happened, they were calling the women that were there to protest their opinion about the pro-life march sluts.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been yelled at by Black Hebrew Israelites. The kids didn't seem fazed by it. They're like, "Oh, these weird guys are yelling strange things at us," and then, but it's when they actually had to interface with actual political actors is when it really got ugly. And I think with the when they were responding to the Black Hebrew Israelites is when they kind of got ramped up into a bit of a fever pitch, but it's when they actually directed that at sincere people is when that dynamic changed. And I know, the kids are young, they're 16-year-old asshole kids, but that doesn't mean they just get a pass for it. Rich white kids get a pass for everything, and why do we have to extend it to them too?
Yeah, there is this. I think that partly what this event shows is that it touches on so many different things. One is so many people have been showing videos of their pep rallies and their games where they're dressed in blackface or they have black paint on them, right, and mocking.
Jesus, I haven't seen the.
Yeah.
Oh wow!
A basketball team came in there that was predominantly black.
I haven't seen those.
Yeah, I've seen videos of that. It also ties in. I know that you said you went to Catholic high school, and I think a lot of people. For me, I didn't go to a school like that. I went to a high school, to a public school, but it was like that mass group of belligerent boys. I don't know, something just like I think a lot of people feel like that was something kind of gross in that.
Yeah.
It touched on a lot of things. And
I think there are these dynamics that are very frightening in general. I think the school pep rally and like that whole kind of vibe that people have.
Yeah.
My wife talks a lot about like being around kind of joking groups of drunk men. There's a very uncomfortable experience. There's like an unpredictability to it, and there's a certain kind of pattern of male behavior. And so like even if it's the most well-intentioned nice guys, it can be really uncomfortable. And I think that's true of like this kind of like school spirit thing. They're chanting their school song. The kid takes off his shirt for some reason and is dancing around.
Yeah.
But it's a space in which they're kind of freed of constraints and able to kind of act almost instinctually. And when they do that, they behave basically as abusive racists.
Do you think it's a pampering of a different way? Like, for instance, I see a lot of pushback now in colleges for safe, there's safe spaces and deplatforming, and these are trigger words, and we can't have that at school anymore. And people get outraged about that they're pampered, they're babies. Where I saw pampering from another way. Like, these people have a pampered lifestyle and they don't have a clue. And that's where like I got into my reptilian brain and got angry, and I couldn't even put the volume up. I haven't watched it with sound because it would just trigger me too much.
Yeah, when people say that they're angry about trigger warnings and safe spaces, they mean they're angry about women and people asking for rights in public spaces.
Yeah.
Like we've had safe spaces for, veterans with PTSD for decades. We've had trigger warnings. Like I grew up in an area with a lot of veterans. People put out signs when they're going to do fireworks. So if someone had, combat vet experience, they know that fireworks are going to be around. That is a trigger warning by its definition. They use this all the time. It's only when it's, in a space where essentially marginalized communities are asking for support, do they start calling it coddling? What I actually think is coddling is looking at a bunch of kids basically having a racist assault on indigenous communities and saying like boys will be boys essentially, and hiring them a PR firm so that they can send out a letter on Twitter. I mean, nothing says coddling like blaming everybody else than your son.
Yeah. I think it's, I don't know, that whole thing. It just seems like this is it's hard to keep up with it, man. You know what I mean? Like, not that it's like, I've been thinking, and because I do the podcast, I'm always trying to, of course, find out about new people to interview and keep up with current events and stuff. But man, it does, like, I don't know, this it just hurts. It hurts the heart, like things seem to be getting to a point. And I don't think it's going to get better, and that's the sad thing. And I don't know. It hurts him almost. I don't know how else to express. I'm just not really able to articulate how I'm feeling right now. But doing this work where I'm kind of constantly engaging with this online media and information being constantly streamed in, and I'm seeing this ugliness, People just say, well, that's just because we live in an age of information, right? We have the internet, we have these phones, I can look at things all the time. We're instantaneously communicating constantly. So you're only seeing what's kind of already been there all the time. It's just now so much more interconnected and so instantaneous that it just seems like things are getting, and the tensions are becoming more heightened. But I don't know. I think maybe it's kind of both. It's like we've created a feedback loop using social media and the Internet of Things, as it's been called, right? That the things that have already existed for so long in this country are now just being reflected back at us at a faster and faster rate. It's reinforcing certain ideological assumptions that certain people have, and they get locked into their own. And we all do it to our own degree too, right? But it's a matter of, I guess, how we choose to engage with this type of information that really maybe sets out certain people apart. Anyway, it's just a comment on the time that we're in. It's hard.
Yeah, Hamilton Morris, who normally writes about drugs and does this
Vice stuff, right?
Yeah, does for Vice about drugs. It talked a bit about like the way that the internet kind of journalism functions is based almost entirely on interacting with something that angers you and really deeply upsets you, and that almost it creates almost like this drug-like experience of like seeking out these emotional kind of explosions, like I know myself by reading things that kind of upset me, and that and I think that the way that social media does that kind of reinforces that. I am not anti-social media at all. I think that there's ways of doing this that are much more healthy and do that, but we have to be really intentional about that. Maybe things are getting worse than they were. Everything, like the history of power and capital and those who control wealth and of crisis, is one of teetering on the edge. But I think it's how we're going to live in resistance to that is going to determine how we feel about it, because we can't let the story that we have about this be those kids. It really can't. We can't survive that. It has to be about Nathan, the person that was resisting them, or what we do next, or how we build relationships while we're doing that work. That has to be the story, because we can't just live inundated all the time. If I was to live constantly with climate collapse, like the fear of essentially the end of the world, I mean, Jesus, I was raised, in a Christian church. I know about the end of the world. It's really frightening. But instead, I want to tell the story of what we are doing, what we're trying to do, even if we failed at it. That's, I think, what we need to really focus on. And instead, if we think of ourselves kind of as the left, we really need to focus on organizing, building community, telling stories, and being supportive of each other, and let that be our base, and let the other stuff just be motivating. I know that's easier said than done, but at least that's, I think, where we should shoot for.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think we had a great conversation. I think this is probably a good spot to to kind of end. I mean, I think we took a direction, at least Rob and I weren't really planning on taking, at least towards the end there, but I think that was a beautiful way to kind of to get at what I was trying to, maybe in a very inarticulate way, trying to express. It's just, again, it's such an emotional thing, and that's what's so difficult to try to kind of articulate that. But Shane, of course you are the author of Fascism Today. Are there any other upcoming projects or any other things that you're working on that's coming out that we should turn people onto?
I have a number of articles coming out, and I will have a book coming out eventually. The ink is not dry yet.
Sure. Okay.
Do you have any? I've always try to find things that you've been interviewed for, whether it's a podcast, a publication. Do you have anything like that people could point to as well? Because I know you get interviewed a lot for various shows and publications.
There was a lot of interviews recently. Let's see. I have an article coming out in Think Progress on the Burgerville Workers Union. Article coming out in Political Research Associates on the kind of fascist entryism into like local GOP. I'm not sure actually about any new interviews besides this one. So I'll have to get back to you on it.
So what's your, just if people want to know, because I know you post this a lot on your Twitter handle. What is your Twitter handle if people want to follow you?
It'd be at Shane Burley, at Shane_Burley1 at Twitter. Yeah, they make it as awkward on me as possible.
And then there's your website. It's at shaneburley.net,
which is a little unupdated until I'm doing kind of revamp on it.
Yeah. I was looking at it, and I was, it's a good spot to like find all your book and everything. Obviously, people want to find your stuff, but yeah, you post pretty regularly on Twitter, so I think that's a good spot for people to
absolutely
find your stuff. Yeah. Well, Shane, thanks for meeting up with us, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot for having me.
Of course.
Breaking my heart in all the right ways, and no, I don't